us this afternoon for a discussion on formal education under the new normal. So to start us off, I would like to call Joel Adriano to give us the opening remarks. He is the regional coordinator for the Asia Pacific SciDev-Net. Joel?
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone here in Manila. So SciDev, an online science media, which is based in the UK, thought about this topic of having a discussion on what will be the new normal on education. Because as we all know, there are over 1 billion students around the world that has been out of school the past few months, and many governments around the world, countries around the world, are wondering whether they should reopen classes now. So in Asia, for instance, what we unlike in Europe and in the US, a lot of the countries in Asia are just opening classes right now. What happened is that a lot of them have readjusted the opening sometime to the last quarter, and there are even suggestions to just simply cancel classes, citing the experiences that they have during World War II, that you just simply have cancel classes for 1 or 2 years, and then do an acceleration of about 1 year if it is a 2-year cancellation or postponement. And then simply the reason why they want to postpone it because of the risk, and just simply wait for the vaccine to come in. And so that's the question that has kind of in our mind as to what would be first is whether what's the reason for reopening now, what will be the, if we are to reopen, what will be the recommendations. Of course, a lot of the classes that have already started, most of them are now online learning. And then based on the experiences of those that already started, like for instance, Salle have already started quite early, and they already have experiences on that. So you could share what will be the mode that they're doing, what will be the policies that they would suggest as to whether, if there are cases like in some Western countries right now, and there are cases of COVID occurring in some schools, what will be the suggested activity or recommendation, whether should schools be closed, or should the local government, or in fact the national government should come in, and what would be the recommendations, should be a local recommendation, a national recommendation, and then finally, we would like to reimagine what will be the future of education, because there are sort of questions bugging a lot of students as to whether would things get back to normal. In fact, that's a question that I always get from a lot of the students I used to teach in one school here. They are quite wondering whether things will get back to normal, and then online learning is kind of temporary. So we would like to hear from our panelists, from our expert, as to what are their thoughts about on this one.
Thank you very much for that, Joel. Thank you. And we are very fortunate to have with us our panelists this afternoon. So let me just give a brief introduction for our panelists. We have Dr. Robert Roleda, who is the current Vice Chancellor for Academics at De La Salle University, Manila, Philippines. He is an Associate Professor of the Physics Department And he was also the former chancellor of the said institution. He is credited as the architect of the DLSU K-12 transition plan. We have also with us Professor David Robie, who is the director of the Pacific Media Center and a journalist of more than 40 years. For more than 2 decades, he has focused on covering the Asia Pacific region, and he has written several books and is currently the editor of Pacific Journalism Review, the only research journal to investigate media issues in the South Pacific, Asia Pacific, Australia, and New Zealand. He received several awards throughout his career, among them in 1985, the New Zealand Media Prize for his coverage of the Rainbow Warrior bombing, a Greenpeace boat that was sunk by the French, which was on its way to protest the planned nuclear test, French Polynesia, the PIMA Media Freedom Award in 2005 for his contribution to development of journalists in New Zealand and the Pacific, and Vice Chancellor Teaching Excellence Award in 2011 and the 2015 AMIC Asia Communication Award that made him the first person in Australasia to receive the honor. We have also with us Professor Dr. Zinaida Fadeeva, who is currently a visiting professor at Nalanda University in India, one of the world's oldest university. She obtained her PhD in Environmental Management and Policy from the International Institute for Industrial Environmental Economics, Lund University, Sweden. A senior specialist in policy and practice of sustainable consumption and production with 25 years of international professional experience, 17 years thereof with UN agencies. She has taught sustainability at a number of universities in China, Japan, India, and Sweden. She has been a scholar at the United Nations University Institute for the Advanced Studies for Sustainability, Japan, where she was engaged in policies and strategies with a particular focus on education for sustainable development, sustainable consumption and production, and the SDGs. She has been leading research activities of the Education ESD team of UNU IAS since 2003. Now, for our viewers, please feel free to type in any of your questions in the Q&A, and we will get to them at the end for the open forum. Perhaps we can begin with David for his brief discussion regarding this particular topic. David, you're on mute.
So did you want my presentation now, or are we doing short? And okay, fine. So I'll go to my, I have a little slide presentation in a very brief one with some of the issues. We've essentially found that education is really going through enormous transformation in New Zealand. With very much, I don't think we'll go back to normal. It's like the theme of this discussion is the new normal. And so it's very much a blended learning, I think, is the experience that we're actually really experiencing now. But if I could go to that slide presentation now. And so are you with me? Can you see this?
No, not yet, David.
Not yet.
Can't see anything yet. Yeah.
Right. So, okay, back to where I was. So sharing the screen. Right. Sorry about this.
All right, there we go.
That's better now. Okay.
Yes.
That's much better. All right. Ready to roll. And in other words, I'm going to start off with a little story to sort of set a context for it, because in the and I think I rather like this sort of image here, because I think that this is what we're really going through, that education's really changing forever. But I do want to start off with this little story that's happened, particularly involving the US and New Zealand. In the middle of last month, President Trump of the United States, and remember it's a population of 331 million, and Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, a population of just 5 million, they had a rather extraordinary jousting event from a distance at opposite ends of the world. Trump called out New Zealand over a minor COVID-19 outbreak, ending more than 3 months of being COVID-free. He condemned New Zealand, whose leader, Jacinda Ardern, had been widely praised globally as the poster heroine of COVID pandemic leadership, is now facing a big surge in cases. And this is what he was saying. The places they were using to hold up as a model, now they're having a big surge. They were holding up names of countries, and now they're saying, whoops, do you see what's happening in New Zealand? They beat it. They beat it. It was like front page news because they wanted to show me something, the US president said at a campaign rally in Mankato, Minnesota. Big surge in New Zealand. You know, it's terrible. We don't want that, but this is an invisible enemy that should never have been let to come to Europe and the rest of the world by China. Well, on that Monday, that particular day, August the 17th, that's in New Zealand, you know, with the time difference. So August the 17th, Auckland recorded 9 new cases of the virus. This was the big surge. And 13 on the next day, Tuesday, while the United States figure on that Monday was 42,000. So it was the first time that Trump had mentioned New Zealand in a campaign speech. On the Tuesday, Prime Minister Ardern responded, saying there was, quote, no comparison, unquote, between the situation in the US and in her country. But President Trump was like a dog with a bone, and he returned to the issue the next day, renewing his ill-founded criticism with no evidence and his disdain for science and knowledge, a situation we've all become very used to. And I would just share this brief video clip with you, which I think is just a brief one, but I think it just sets the scene very well. Jacinda, by the way, was not a teacher, but she was a researcher before becoming a politician. So Melanie, if you would give us that little clip. Thank you.
Even New Zealand, you see what's going on in New Zealand. They beat it, they beat it. It was like front page, they beat it because they wanted to show me something. The problem is big surge in New Zealand. So, you know, it's terrible. We don't want that.
We know by now to take everything that Donald Trump says with an enormous grain of salt. But coming from the leader of a country that had 42,000 new cases just yesterday, I think it's an absurd comparison.
Obviously, I don't think there's any comparison between New Zealand's current cluster and the tens of thousands of cases that are being seen daily in the United States. Obviously, every country is experiencing its own fight with COVID-19. It is a tricky virus, but not one where I would compare New Zealand's current status to the United States. New Zealand's 9 cases in a day does not compare to the United States' tens of thousands, and in fact does not compare to most countries in the real world. I'm not concerned about people misinterpreting our status.
The American people can work out that we have for a whole day what they have every 22 seconds of a day. That speaks for itself.
So just following on from this, Toby Manhart, one of the editors of a New Zealand startup publication called Spinoff, remarked in a Twitter feed. Incidentally, this Spinoff was started off by one of our journalism graduates. But anyway, Toby Manhart said, well, it's very tricky to say why the scientists, the modelers, the public servants, health workers, teachers, supermarket workers, politicians, businesses, people denied tangi. Tangi is actually a funeral in New Zealand, weddings and millions who have myriad sacrifices and suddenly clear now. He added it was to show Donald Trump something, taking the president's quote and reversing it. The facts are that overall 25 people have died from COVID-19 in New Zealand and 1,833 have been infected, compared with more than 205,000 deaths and 7.4 million infections in the US. Now, according to a couple of researchers, Maisie and Richardson, Jacinda Ardern appears to have delivered President Trump a masterclass in crisis management, and they pointed out that this seems rather odd on the face of it. As they sum it up, Ardern, at the age of just 39, is both young and relatively inexperienced in leadership. Before becoming Prime Minister in 2017, she had never run a big organization and was said to have no burning desire to lead her country. By contrast, the 75-year-old US president had led the multi-billion-dollar Trump organization since 1971 and survived many business crises. And of course, he was highly ambitious. Well, anyway, the success of Jacinda Ardern has been largely thanks to effective pandemic firefighting and strong crisis leadership. It has also been due to Ardern's reliance on health experts and scientists, in contrast to many world leaders, including such as Trump. Ironically, her very efficient education minister, Chris Hipkins, also took on the health portfolio during the lockdown, and this must be rather unique in the world. Macy and Richardson argue that the new normal COVID-19 world has generated a new conventional wisdom, namely that the economy will never be the same again. The authors point out that while some business sectors adapted quickly to online trading, including major grocery foodstuffs, so this is in New Zealand, many workers and their employers had found that working from home could be really effective and even efficient. Innovation has also become the order of the day in education at both secondary and tertiary levels. And this era of the webinar and remote teaching by Zoom and MS Teams was ushered in. As the Teaching Council Matato Aotearoa put it in a reflective policy paper, COVID-19 has led to unprecedented change and upheaval for teaching and learning in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's continued in a statement in this paper of research that teachers have shown incredible flexibility, innovation and responsiveness to new and different ways of teaching and learning. So what has been learned while this period of lockdown? New Zealand had 4 weeks going into 6 weeks, and then it's just had a second period in the largest city, Auckland. So anyway, the research that these researchers found, they did some snapshots of learning gathered from a number of sources across the sector as teachers, learners, parents and whānau, that's families, reflect and returned to a new kind of normal. According to some other researchers, Riwai Couch and her team of researchers, the new normal involved finding ways to further strengthen partnerships and value the learning that happens across the boundaries between homes and schools. And it seems an important step in expanding our view of what counts as quality education, making schooling more equitable and honouring New Zealand's 1840 Treaty of Waitangi, where there's bipartisan, bicultural partnership between Indigenous Māori and more recent residents in New Zealand. The COVID-19 lockdown provided a unique opportunity to critically reflect on authentic partnerships with parents and whānau or their families and carry it forward. And some of the findings were that technology has been used widely for the family and teachers to connect from home to school during lockdown. But this connection can be continued, but in reverse, from the schools back to home. And teachers have had to adapt and innovate to ensure learning is whānau friendly or family friendly. Learners introducing their family to their teachers and peers online has provided a deeper personal level of connections, which can continue to be built on. And parents and families have learnt even more about their children, their strengths and how they learn, which provides a great opportunity to work together in partnership. In terms of assessment, planning and teaching, there is a unique opportunity for a stronger focus on working theories and the way in which educators and teachers can better understand our children's perspective on the world and the impact of recent events in their lives. New Zealand universities are grappling with a huge economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, and the hole in funding from international students, because many of the, pretty well most of the universities in New Zealand have depended in recent years a lot on the international students. Immigration in New Zealand showed that there were merely 47,087 foreign students in the country by last month, a drop of some 13,000 since the start of lockdown. The figures indicated that polytechnics and private education institutions had lost about a quarter of their foreign students since March, while schools and universities had lost 1/5 of their students. So no foreign students have been allowed into New Zealand since the borders were closed to non-residents on March the 19th, and students from China were stopped in early February. To enable school pupils to continue learning at home during lockdown from mid-April, the Ardern Coalition government sent out hard copy education packages and more than 17,000 electronic devices as part of an $87 million educational package. The government also worked with internet service providers to deliver modems to households that needed them, with thousands expected to be sent out each week. There are about 350 households in different remote parts of New Zealand where there was currently no internet potential of any kind, and the government considered satellite coverage in those cases. Explaining the huge effort for the 4-week lockdown, and as I mentioned, stretched into 6 weeks initially, Education Minister Chris Hipkins, and by now he's actually the Health Minister as well, said the priority in planning was for, quote, developing robust distance learning infrastructure and a more resilient system so that learners receive education in any scenario. However, there are challenges to overcome in this online education and this blended learning, and students without reliable internet access or technology struggle to participate in digital learning. This gap is seen across countries and between income brackets within countries. For example, while 95% of students in Switzerland, Norway and Austria, for example, have a computer to use for their schoolwork, only 34% in Indonesia do so. And in New Zealand, a growing digital divide was exposed between the haves and the top decile schools and poorer decile schools where many students did not have equitable access. At my own university, a survey of students after the first lockdown period, and by that time they'd been teaching, all our courses had been restructured to be online, but in the survey they showed a strong majority wanting a return to face-to-face teaching. So my last few images here are from my own School of Communication Studies Facebook page, which has been incorporated. Yes, just finishing now.
Yeah, but the slides are not showing. I think
oh, really?
they've been unshared. Yes.
Oh, I wish you'd told me there. Yeah. So
sorry.
What? None of the slides. Oh, you didn't.
Okay,
you
then
haven't seen
you can share now. Yeah.
You can see them now.
Not yet.
Oh. Oh, right. Oh, I'm sorry about that. No, dear, oh dear. Okay, right. I might have to sort of go back to here. And that's right. I forgot to, sorry about that. I'm sorry. So sorry about that. Now, this is what I was talking about a moment ago, and then I was just finishing on this slide here. Can you see this now?
No, not
is it
yet.
okay?
It's
No,
still not showing. Yeah.
So just a part of this one. Can you see this now?
No, not yet.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, look, I think it's just about, it's just finishing up here.
Okay.
Look, I'm so sorry. Right. Sorry about that. Apologies.
Okay. Professor David?
Sorry, I thought I finished because you hadn't seen the slides. I'm so sorry, but I finished
Oh,
my
okay.
presentation for the moment. So
All right, but maybe we can hear more about it later.
yes,
Yes. So
yeah,
we'll
so
hear more about it later on in our open
yeah,
forum.
yeah.
So thank you so much for what you mentioned. Now I'd like to hear from Dr. Robert Roleda. Yes, please.
Yes. Yeah. Pretty much like most of the world, I think online education has become the primary means of coping with the COVID or the pandemic. We were towards the end of our trimester when COVID, the pandemic struck sometime in March in the Philippines. And right away we went online because the university has actually been preparing to transition towards a blended learning environment. So somehow we were prepared for some kind of online education. But what happened really was it became a full online education, which is very much different from a blended learning situation. And the first response we got really from the students are anxieties about, because they have to adjust to the new way of learning. And so there were a lot of outcries about anxieties, about too much work, about not getting in touch with the faculty, not being able to get in touch with the faculty for some time. All of these were actually adjustments that we have to, situations, conditions that you have to adapt to very quickly. The faculty and the teachers and the students have to adapt to this very quickly. And for like most other institutions in the Philippines, we postponed actually the opening of our next trimester to give us time to prepare, to catch our breath, to prepare for really a fully online learning modality of education. So I guess pretty much around the world, we have this kind of experiences. David talked about the disparity in connectivity. There are also a lot of outcries about not everyone having the connectivity that will enable them to do online learning. And so there was a lot of outcry in the Philippines actually to stop education, totally, because not everyone can do it. So there are people who are getting left behind. So our Commission on Higher Education actually did a lot of things to encourage the higher education institutions to prepare themselves, not necessarily for online learning, but flexible learning using different modalities. So in some cases, for example, some institutions or some schools are bringing teaching materials, learning materials to the homes of the students and let them do the work at home. There are also initiatives to using televisions and radio to deliver education as well. Well, I guess in the current normal, getting in-person classes, getting back to in-person classes will I think take a long time to come yet. We will probably be seeing another year or two of pure online learning. So when we talk about new normal, I'm thinking of new normals. What happens after the pandemic pass, maybe in a year or two? And my assessment, my impression is that we are not going to go back to the old ways of doing things. Not because we cannot go back to the old way of doing things. I think what the pandemic did was to accelerate our adaptation of digital education. And once we have gone into that, I think there is no turning back. Digital education has its advantages and its disadvantages, much like anything else. And but it can enhance the way we deliver in-person education. So when the new normal comes, it's going to be a blended learning environment. So this, at least, is something that the pandemic brought for us.
Thank you for that,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Robert. Now let's hear from Professor Zinaida.
Greetings again, everybody, and greetings to the audience. So let me start with honoring Joel, your earlier request and introduction of this webinar on trying as closely as possible answer the question about possibilities of opening, and opening we interpret in terms of direct physical engagement. As our colleagues already emphasized, online learning with pros and cons already going on, and we touch it a little bit later. And after that, allow me maybe to speak a little bit more about how closed are those closed institutions of higher education at the moment and what it really means during this time. So opening or not is really a dilemma. The question of opening institutions, higher education, is easy to appreciate, but very difficult to address, as we all know. It is simple to understand, as it is clear that institutions of higher education have to function on two conditions. Number one, if they operate in a manner that, and in the environment around the institutions, that provides safety of operations and people, whoever we are talking about. And also it's able to provide assistance to its personnel, students, and important immediate stakeholders in case of emergency. Under other circumstances, physical contact would be rather difficult. So in Kenya, for example, the approach, individualized approach of the higher education institutions, universities, applying for authorization to start based on developed criteria is done by one by one. If institution is able to prove its safety or COVID-proof nature at the moment, then operations are allowed. Now, in short, opening, or rather physical opening, is to be done when institutions are able to protect its people. What are those safety standards is, of course, the question, and they are not the simple ones. So they are actually defining the conditions, opening or not. It is about, of course, general behavior of the students and the staff. If a particular rituals or rules, mask wearing, physical distancing is possible or not. If there are facilities to fulfill the requirements, there. It is also about availability of tests in the region. It's about availability of tracing instruments. It's about availability of the medical facilities. It's about established treatment protocols. It's about living arrangements of the students, of the staff. It's about I mentioned medical facilities. It's about really the whole logistics organized around the universities and in the region. That all defines to open or not to open. So not simple preparation of the individual institutions. And that's just to complicate this. So what is really interesting that into this consideration of pure safety, physical safety, an ability of the countries or region handle the cases of emergency or not allow the emergency, comes the whole principle of not leaving anybody behind. And this, as we all know, the basic principle behind SDG, Sustainable Development Goals. And this principle sometimes, again, plays very interesting role. So one is, as colleagues already emphasized, pushes the activities of the university or government working with the university or other stakeholders helping the university to reach to those which are not able easily possess either broadband connectivity or the same computer or the telephones, right? So that's one way of interpreting. Another very interesting interpretation of not or getting beyond inequality is actually insisting on face-to-face education. And it is not a matter of the developing countries only. Perhaps some of you know that University of Sorbonne, some of the schools there do allow physical education in spite of what is clearly defined at the moment as overcrowding. So there are no possibility of keeping physical distance simply because there are not enough teachers to teach this number of students which are enrolling for the courses. Let us not again judge it harshly, because as we said before, it is the whole system which allows universities to run physical encounters or not. We are talking about France, whether University of Sorbonne is able to afford handling emergency, or if behavior of students, for example, to wear masks is enforceable. It is an interesting set of factors which are defining these decisions. Okay, so to highlight, to open physical encounter or not is a rather complex factor which goes beyond preparedness of the university to provide sanitation and physical distances. So that's one aspect which I wanted to bring for our discussion, and yeah, just to complicate the issue. Question, and let me skip the whole issue of online learning. We probably will come back to this in our discussion, but this is the issue of finances and the area of activities and what is closed, what is not. Universities and other higher education institutions do acknowledge financial implication. We all know about this of the pandemic. The traditional revenue streams do severely diminished, or at the risk of being diminished gradually or dramatically in the future. This is really quite obvious. Students' debt crisis may rise, and employment could increase for the families of the current students and for the graduates. So graduates are thinking about that. That is a situation where with all sectors, not only universities at the moment. So while governments disperse financial resources in different countries, financial planning at the level of higher education institution is naturally needs to be done very differently at the moment. For example, institutions of higher education would probably need to seek delay or cancellation of some payments, or differentiation of essential and non-essential resources and services. They would probably need to adjust funding schemes and scholarships. They probably would need to go for those very useful partnerships which Dr. Robie spoke about, which is already happening. how it is to be done is based on strategic vision of individual SDGs. And here we are talking about two categories. One is rather frugal, which are about cutting expenses, and another are about really going much more broader to the community engagement, much stronger with private sector, with the government, etc., etc. So let us also remember that the institutions of higher education are not only about education of students, and this is what we are, of course, focused so far, but it is also about research and social engagements. Those three are the pillars of the higher education institutions. And we cannot say at the moment that other two also uniformly suffered throughout the pandemic. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. So already at the initial stage of the pandemic in March and April, International Association of Universities did a survey of its 500 members, and 400 plus returned the results answering. So where 2/3 of those universities, and remember it was at the beginning of the pandemic, which was really a stage of shock and surprise and really not really knowing what to do. But already at that time, universities, 2/3 of the university globally, and majority of them actually were in Asia Pacific, did say that they are engaged strongly in the research related to the pandemic, and they are consulting the government on various policies with respect to the pandemics. Today, I'm sure, well, I don't have these numbers, but I have a hunch I have a hunch that probably the numbers showing engagement with the communities and with government would be better. So examples from Southeast Asian universities show engagement along the line of provision of information, along the line of distributing of protective gears, along the food distribution, education for groups other than students, etc. And in fact, yesterday I chatted with three colleagues from three universities in Philippines, which shared what did they do during this several months. But let me just not focus on this, except unless we have time later, unless to say that the obvious difference of the activities of the universities in the time of the pandemic with other partners trying to support communities, it's much more strategic and systematic way of engagement. And that is something which is extremely important. So it's not just a charity, you go and give a food, you try to select as a university system which would create reliant or self-reliant food supply for the area. For example, University of Cebu, I think it is a subsidiary of the University of Philippines, if I understand correctly, is doing for many months now this kind of work with their community, just to avoid the starvation under any future crisis like this or something like that. So the mentioned International Association of Universities survey also showed that already in May, half of the university reported that their partnership got weakened, but 31% said that not only 31% said that they developed much more interesting and innovative partnerships. And this is what David, you were saying about as an important factor for development of the communities of knowledge with higher education at the center, or at least being a very essential part. So I suspect, again, at the moment, it is much more important and prominent area of activity. So what it all mean? Let me just summarize it and probably reflect a little bit more at another opportunity. Perhaps we face now realization that the third pillar of higher education institutions or universities work, which is engagement with the society, stops to be the poor sister of other two pillars, which is research and education. In practical terms, it might be the space where universities could really grow. It also means that in this area it has to be much more closely connected to the methodologies of learning and action research. So it's, again, not simply taking students or yourself to the community, doing some one-off activity, but it's really some change-driven, comprehensive, very well understood area of activity relying on strong methodologies of learning and engagement. Now, it means that new skills of bringing results of research to the communities and the government also needs to be developed. So writing a policy brief skill is very different from writing a scientific paper. And so perhaps this kind of challenge could be addressed or is being already addressed by the universities. And speaking practically, and let me just finish there, it means, so this kind of retooling could also bring different revenue streams, not from traditional ministries of higher education or ministries of education, but really proving its use for the regional governments, for the national governments, and for the private sector. And again, let me stop here and perhaps pick up some of the points, depends on the flow of our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Zinaida. And I really like that our panelists come from different regions. And I'm sure that in each region you have different experiences as well. Okay, so I'd like to remind our audience that you may type in your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom. So if you have any questions for our panel, just feel free to type it in. So perhaps can I have some reactions from Joel or Ben?
Okay. You have a question?
Hi, Joel.
Hi. Yeah. So you might probably want to ask first. Okay, go ahead, Ben.
Go ahead, Ben. Yeah.
So I have a question for Dr. Robie, actually. So you talked about the shifting boundary between home and school. Could you explain a bit more what that is, and also how that's shifting boundary, how those changes are likely to impact on the future of education? I think you're on mute.
Yeah. Yes, I think that strikes to the core of some very fundamental values in a country like New Zealand, where you have this partnership between the indigenous Maori people originally and more recent people who've come to the country, and the principle of bicultural partnership. And I think that what has happened here is this process has shown that by establishing much greater collaboration and partnership between families and schools, which was regarded very widely as a sort of principle of education among Indigenous people generally, that this is going to have an impact probably very much on policy and interaction between the way that schools have approached this, and also it's been becoming quite a challenge in universities as well, as the principles of partnership under the Treaty of Waitangi, and the during lockdown, it sort of enabled this opportunity, I guess, of education sort of moving out of the schools much more into homes, and hadn't probably been much thinking around strategically around how this could actually happen. And so this is very much, I think, a process that's happening at this moment.
Yeah, thanks for that. Joel?
Okay. Just before my question, I would like to, by the way, in the opening, to thank Kathleen, Aviso, and Dr. Robert Roleda from Salle, because they've been quite I used a helpful partner for SciDev for many years now. And just recently, to tell everyone that Kay has been cited as one of the rising scientists in Asia. Okay. We also have another panelist that wasn't able to join, unfortunately. So they informed me that they were called in the Senate for a budget hearing. The alternative one, which is the Secretary of Science and Technology, also turned out that he is in the same budget hearing, all three, the higher education, the Department of Education, and the Department of Science and Technology are all in the budget hearing right now in the Senate. Okay. For my question, one for Dr. Robert Roleda, as I was wondering, how did you actually retool the university when it comes to certain courses, which is kind of difficult to actually have it online? Like, for instance, when you talk of HRM, a lot of that involves actual cooking, things like that. So, and then there are specific subjects as well that will need actual physical presence, like PE. So how did the university dealt with those kind of courses and subjects?
Yeah. Well, our university does not offer hotel and restaurant management, so I cannot answer that. But one thing that's related to that is the on-the-job training program, which practically all programs have. Pretty much most of this also went online. Fortunately, there are a good number of companies that offered online on-the-job training. I'm sure the experience will be very different from a physical on-the-job training, but that's the best that we can offer so far. As one of the activities that would actually require in-person to be present for a student to be physically present will be laboratories. Science laboratories. That's one of the big areas that we are still grappling to try to attain. But we are not really 100% at the loss here. There are a number, especially for the more basic laboratory courses. There are approaches that we have made. For example, in physics, where it come from. There are a lot of sensors that are found in our mobile phones, accelerators and so on, accelerometer and so on, that we can actually use to measure things, timers and so on. So pretty much our basic physics lab, including in the high schools, are done at home, but supervised online. So the teacher will be on camera in contact with the students, and while the students do the laboratory activities at home. There are also some apps, like some apps that provide virtual experience for laboratories. As for physical education, basically they still do the physical activity at homes with video coming from the teacher. So the teacher will lead the group in activity while the students do it at home through Zoom or other meeting apps. So there are ways to continue some of these physical activities, even if being in the same place is not possible.
Thank you for that. And we have a question which is somehow related to this question. So let me mention it. So this one comes from Habib, who is in Bahrain. So there is no real issue with online education for universities and colleges, except perhaps for practical studies. So the real issue is with youngsters and with families with 2 or more children trying to learn from home. What practical solutions do you suggest? So anyone from the panel, please feel free to respond to this one. Yes, Zinaida, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I'm not a specialist in primary or secondary education. I look quite carefully at the policies there. So let me just share the concern to start with, that indeed, while it comes to the more mature learners in the area of technical vocational education or area of the university, it is probably, at least for some relatively limited period of time, easy or easier to manage education. And let me come back to this with a little bit critical swing. It is really, truly, incredibly tough when it comes to the education in the remote areas, in already disadvantaged region, in the region where parents which are in the equation when you speak about distance learning on current cannot really help the kids, where all economic factors are coming again into equation and kids are being pulled to the family effort to provide some kind of livelihood. So that is something which is incredibly difficult. It is happening everywhere. It certainly is a huge criticism in India. It is a huge loss. So we do lose a lot of kids to this education. We do lose gains in not only in the area of education, but early child marriage, health, etc. So there is abuse going out of youngsters or the girls. It's all very much there. Solutions are being offered through different NGOs very often. This is what I'm seeing in India. There are some higher education institutions which are trying to extend its capabilities to the school. I do know that university in northern Mindanao actually is taking patronage of one of the regional schools, where they are helping them at least with some issues of survival. I don't think it is with education, but it is really supporting the pupils of the school and their families throughout hard time with food or some livelihood opportunities. I think that some maybe activities of the government also are extended towards that in terms of providing maybe the funding support to the teachers, but I can't quite see that situation is less than absolutely devastatingly dramatic all over. So there are different, we can list tens and tens of different good practices, but it is a huge loss and tragedy. Now, can I just mention one of the small development which is happening in India with respect to the school education, or there is a new educational policy which is called India National Educational Policy, which came into the game right about now and is being very widely discussed. And this policy does extend education to the preschool education to sort of get kids online. While there are many celebrated praises towards this policy. The educators, the specialists in education rather than in development, let's sort of differentiate between those two, say that in fact this policy does more harm than good to the primary particular education of the kids, because it came without consideration of the reforms which are being on the way following what is called the Right to Education Act, introduced in India 10 years ago. And a lot of reform have been happening in different regions, and suddenly the new reform came with good considerations, but really without seeing what kind of downside in terms of implementation you will see if one reform being smacked on another one. So there are much more worrying challenges coming on in addition to the COVID situation. If you look at the school and primary or preschool education, this is really quite devastating. And I'm glad that some of the universities now are starting to pay much more attention to the educational departments and trying to empower and work with them closely along this line. Let me just focus there, but it's a tragedy. It's really a tragedy.
Thank you for that. What about you, David? Any thoughts about this?
David, you are on mute. Sorry.
Yeah, David,
Sorry, no, I won't add to that. I think it's very, very well expressed there. Thank you.
What about Doc Bobby?
I can't say much about basic education, especially early childhood education. So I'm not an expert in that area.
Okay, thank you for that. So the next question comes from Ranjit. So in India and South Asia, COVID-19 has had the effect of reversing gains in getting children into schools. With declining incomes, they have had to join the workforce, and this could be a permanent. According to the UN, something like 24 million children could drop out of school because of the virus and lockdowns. Zinaida, do you want to comment further regarding this? Actually, it's not a question, it's more of a comment.
I think it is a comment, and I said enough. And again, going with, in line with Robert's caution that not looking very carefully on this. Well, I share this worry very much, but I think that it is entirely different and very long discussion, which perhaps our colleagues from SciDev webinar series can bring as another time for focused discussion on that.
Yeah, thanks for that. All right, so the next one comes from Angeline Lau. So for all panelists, what do you think are the positive and negative feedbacks of this? What are the positive and negative feedbacks from the students, parents, and educators in your respective countries? How did you address these feedbacks?
Maybe I'll start.
Okay, yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. A lot of issues about online education, at least when it began, is the traditional way we look at online education is that these are actually self-directed learning, but not all learners are self-directed. So there is a lot of adjustment. There were a lot of adjustment that we did in our institution. For example, in March when it started, we basically look at the connectivity issue. Okay, and so let's our initial response is let's try to do less of the synchronous activities that would require more bandwidth, and try to do things, let the students do them at their own pace. But there were a lot of difficulties that the students faced in that regards. So in the following trimester, we adjusted our system. Sorry about that. Adjusted our system to encourage, to make our faculty actually engage the students more in the learning, not just leave them to do work on their own, but to accompany them, make sure that there's a weekly meeting with them, synchronous. Not everyone can be present during a synchronous session, so encourage the recording of the sessions as well, so that at least the questions of their classmates, that the students will know about the questions of the classmates. And a lot of the engagements are also done asynchronously through chats and discussion boards. So these are some of the things that we really try to encourage our faculty members to engage the student in the content, to make activities that will make the students engage with their classmates. Education is not just about the content, it's also about building relationships, collaborating with your classmates, and so on. So those are the things that we really try to emphasize on our second run as far as pure online education is concerned.
David, maybe you can give us insights on the situation there.
Well, I would like to just make some comments about because my own area is actually journalism, and the style and techniques involved in journalism education. We generally have fairly small, relatively small groups that are involved in our coursework, and so there's quite a bit of negative feedback from students when the survey was done at my university after the first period of lockdown, which was the 6 weeks. They really wanted to return to like we have a large newsroom framework where most students are involved in this this area where there's a lot of collaborative work, a lot of teamwork, and so on. And of course, once they went into a period of 6 weeks online teaching, although there was a lot of support from staff and so on, it really could not replicate the sort of structure that we have in this newsroom environment, which is what they normally face when joining media organizations and so on. So that was quite stressful, I think, for a lot of students. And also at the same time, staff found it really stressful as well. And then we had a second period of lockdown, which just ended about 3 weeks ago now. That was only really applied to the largest city, Auckland. And my faculty really made the decision to go to continue with online teaching at that stage rather than go back to our course structure within sort of newsroom, mainly because there was a potential that we could have a further lockdown and so on. So they thought rather it's only 5 weeks left for the semester to end. So it was felt that we would continue on that sort of process. Now that was rather different from some other faculties that actually returned to to basically teaching within a class type environment and that sort of thing. But one of the major problems, I think, was particularly in journalism, so much technology used these days, is that many students do not have access to a lot of the software that we use, and so it's limitations for example, those who are working on a lot of television video work, that sort of thing. So that adds another level of stress that students actually face. So when I talked a bit earlier on about blended learning, I was largely talking about an overall approach to education where the changes were definitely happening right across the board in New Zealand. But I'd say in areas like my own field, there's still, I'd say, a preference for something. Certainly the blended form will very much involve going back into a newsroom framework very much so, and I think that's really important.
Thank you. Zinaida?
Sorry, it takes time to find the button.
Yes.
Yeah, so let me very briefly answer this and maybe comment on a couple of questions which typed in the chat. Also briefly, I mostly heard complaints from the colleagues rather than from the students. Students were complaining, but mostly about technical lack of savviness of their of their guides. So that was my experience in April and May. David, I agree with you. So the initial discontent with this actually somewhat got smoothened or disappeared. So people found different ways of functioning. So I'm not sure if it's a new normal or intermediate normal, how normal will remain. It seems like everyone is changing anyway, so norm is change. But what really is happening now is that, and this is where I guess institutions of higher education as an institution should probably lend assistance to its personnel, its academics, its teachers. So once the certain degree of proficiency is reached in running the webinars, and certain comfort level is reached, so the further effort somewhat has a tendency to stop. And maybe this is when capacity building of the educators, which are not professional educators, but I mean, they're professional educators, but they're not educators by degree, by qualification. Maybe this is where a little bit gentle nudging and encouragement could happen more systematically and being initiated by the university. So this is my experience in terms of the complaints or feedbacks. Again, I also do work with rather small groups of the students, which are mostly dealing with technologies for sustainable development or with business working towards sustainable development. So it's small, rather exclusive groups. So they are very techie savvy, and it's rather easy to work with them. So it's I am personally not a good judge. But one of the there are two questions online here, and one of them is an invitation to assess Sweden's decision to compel parents to send their children to school, and another is about the minimum requirement benchmark or standards when children or learners of any kind can or should or would or have to go and attend education in person. You know, I lived in Sweden for 8 years, and I studied there, worked there, and I think that it's rather difficult to, if you allow me to use word force, to force Swedish population to do what they don't want to do. I also know, for at least the private schools, I didn't speak to the parents whose kids are in a public school yet, but after your question, it's Habib Tomi asking us. I certainly will try to figure it out. So for private school, there are some degrees of flexibility, particularly if the kid lives in a family which has very vulnerable elderly people, etc. So there are certain degrees of flexibility. And generally how decisions are being done in Sweden, in my view, it's not somebody from the top comes and offers you a certain document to vote for. It is rather meticulous one-to-one or group-to-group consultation before anything is put into public. So I'm not sure what prompt your question. Probably my ignorance that something is being really forced or twisted, and some people are not very happy. But also another small observation that my surprise, or it's not a surprise, it's all understandable, but I often see that reaction of people on lockdown or social attitude towards COVID, etc., is very, very different dependent on their circumstances in the country. My Japanese colleagues absolutely don't understand why we are so strict about behavior well in the society outside. Why don't we take public transportation? They actually don't really know what's happening very often in India or in Bangladesh or some other countries in the region. So the same for some of the Scandinavian countries. In Sweden or in Denmark, it's also rather relaxed and sort of common sense, come whatever we call comes. we have immunity, we have systems to take care about this, etc., etc. So that's a short reaction. But again, forgive me, I might not know something about Swedish prompting of the kids or learners to go to the face-to-face learning. The question about minimum requirements again is very difficult, but needs to be discussed. I spoke about this at the very beginning. The safety standards that allow opening are defined by factors which characterize the functioning of the individual universities as well as of the society in itself. It is about general behavior. It's about enforceability of this behavior. It's about medical system preparedness to treat people. It's about testing and tracing system which exists or doesn't exist. It's about how people move, socialize, where do they live, how do they travel, all of this. And it needs to be assessed individually for each of the region. Even more critical, I think, it is about ability to introduce a flexible system that can react to situation quickly and critically. So it is really about restrictions which can also be intelligent. It's intelligent sort of restrictions or lockdowns, which quite a few countries now for the second lockdown or restrictions are coming to. The same goes for the universities. So let me just stop here for the moment.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. You also mentioned earlier when you gave your discussion about the different pillars for higher education learning. And I think maybe let's talk about some of the pros and cons of this new situation. We have one question here from Raymond Tan, who's asking about whether the Zoom era can enable a more widespread frictionless mobility of academics and sharing of content across borders. Do you think any such changes will persist after the pandemic? So anyone wants to take a shot at that question? So like for this forum, for example, it has made it better for us to actually get every one of you here in this particular forum. So do you think that such things will persist after the pandemic?
Yes.
Any thoughts? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I
Robie.
start again? Yeah, I think one of the bright spots of this pandemic is it showed us how we can. There are actually ways that wherein we can get more engaged with people from all around the world through Zoom or whatever apps you have. But this, of course, is limited to face-to-face, online discussion like this. But the real work of research will still have to go. You have to go to the lab physically. A lot of research, you will really have to go experimental research, particularly. You will really have to go to the laboratories. And as long as there are restrictions of movement, that's going to impair a lot of researches. Maybe it's good to remember that the internet started with well, at least was how do you call this? The development of internet was enhanced by collaborations in the sciences. The CERN, for example, the World Wide Web, arose from the collaboration, the desire to collaborate with people all around the world. And I guess this is the fruit that the project like CERN brought to us, that allowed us to continue to engage with other people around the world, even after, even during a pandemic like this. I'm sure after the pandemic, with the new normal, this kind of communication will continue, will persist. But in the end, it's still a lot of the dirty work, a lot of the real work will have to be done physically. And as long, yeah.
Okay, thank you for that, Dr. Bobby. Any additional thoughts?
Well, I agree with you, Robert. I think that the only small addition is that the dirty work would be not only related to the laboratory. So a lot of people who are working in the area of business management or technology innovation. So we would need to have a face-to-face encounter really to get to establish rapport and get the information, etc. Generally about the whole questions of if any of this will remain, yes, I think it will. Whether they would be winners or losers, yes, it would be definitely winners and losers. I'm not quite sure how, for example, we are going to get with all the questions of sort of star lecturers which are sitting in particular universities, and therefore everybody's coming there, and suddenly this star lecturer or a researcher cannot really receive the guest, etc. So that is to be seen. So for the time being, these star lecturers become much more accessible to all of us. But what it would be for the future, I don't know. And somebody was asking about a sort of preferential or preference of the local students in developing countries towards own country universities at the expense of the developed countries. Could that be happening? Yes, probably it could be. Or developed countries, particularly very high-level universities, would have to revise the structure of fees for attending them, allowing attendance from the distance. So we will wait and see, but certainly there would be winners and losers. And somebody is asking also about the qualifications of the pedagogues which are online, conducting online learning. Yes, it is a big problem. So a lot of countries are providing quite a big capacity building opportunity for them. Slowly it gains momentum. But no, not all of the teachers who were good in class or who were bad in class are necessarily delivering fantastic lectures or facilitation online.
Thank you. And David, I think you were about to say something.
Sure, yes. Well, yes, I guess my comments would be around, I've seen a definite change in a country like New Zealand being remote from much of the rest of the world, and much of academic discourse is sort of focused on Europe and North America to a large degree. And our own region is very much neglected, even in the Pacific. Apart from those who specialize in those sort of areas. We have very little contact in an academic context with much of Asia, for example. And I have noticed that very much in the last few months that there have been a number of conferences, webinar. There's one in Indonesia just recently, a two-day one that some of us participated in. And I think that's actually a tremendous step forward for a country like New Zealand. And I think that would very much continue. But one of the debates that has gone on among academics at universities such as mine is, of course, the clamp on research funding. There's an element of research funding that already has been allocated for conferences. And of course, academic staff look forward to these conferences for networking and for building up global connections and so on. And of course, that's been impossible in recent times, particularly the country like New Zealand has a very tight border policy at the moment. But presumably there will be a period when we'll come back to something like conferences. But I would certainly hope to see that our communications through webinars and through a more open regional contact. I think if, with my own faculty, for example, we have a lot more contact with Indonesia, Philippines, and other parts of Asia that we didn't really have much of that before. So I think that would be a really positive thing that would, and I'm sure that will continue.
Okay, thank you for that, David. Now we have a lot more questions, but unfortunately, we've run out of time. So maybe I just want to ask SciDev, before we move on to close this session, is there a way for our audience to reach out to our panelists? Joel? Yeah, Joel, you're on mute.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, about that. So you can actually email me. You can actually visit the website, SciDev.net. In particular, our is the Asia Pacific edition. You can email me or Milani Sison, which is there in the screen. And then we will forward any questions to our panelists. And if there are additional comments, or in fact, earlier Zinaida was saying that she might look into the public sector, at least in the case of Sweden. She might probably have an answer later on. And so I will share that to the rest of those who have provided their emails, and especially those who ask questions for this webinar. Yes, Zinaida?
I'm terribly sorry, but I thought that it is one more important point to make. We were speaking about opening of the higher education institutions and challenges and innovations which did happen at the moment. Much of this discussion has been done from the perspective of sort of disadvantage and advantage in practicalities. But I just wanted to perhaps finish by reminding us that, again, there are two perspectives on education exist at the moment. One of them is more development, education as a contributor to better jobs, to development of the country, etc. But another one is a classic one, and this is what UNESCO is supporting and our educators are supporting, is education. It's a perspective which sees education above all as a way of creating a citizen, right? So ethical individual, which is able to act for the benefit of the society. And the proponents of this perspective very strongly contest visions of university as solely job training institutions for the students. And it's also important to think that universities are able to, you know, offer this kind of good ethical and value-driven individuals. And to do that, the question of face-to-face engagement or much more personalized engagement might be rather seriously considered. And we should not really forget about this perspective, which is very often being overridden by practical development take on the education. Thank you for that, but I thought it's very, very important to emphasize this point.
Yes. Thank you very much for that, Zinaida. And perhaps SciDev can arrange future forums that are more focused on different aspects that you can touch upon regarding the way forward in the education sector. So I'm sorry, but that's all the time we have now. So I'd like to call on Ben Dayton, the managing editor of SciDev.net, to give us the closing remarks.
Hi there. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists. This has been a really very interesting discussion and has given us a lot to follow up on. SciDev.net, we're all about opening fora, creating fora for debate and discussion, and this has been a really great example of that. And we've got some of the ideas that have come up that will deserve follow-up are this shifting boundary between homes and schools. I mean, that's terribly important as we move into this new normal, and looking at how that's going to affect education in the future. Also, the question of a digital divide, and that's always been a concern for us, but now more than ever, that's really going to affect societies and change life chances, and it's something which there's so much to say and so many examples of how that's affecting people, but not only just negatively, but also positively. And it was really interesting to hear about how education is being delivered by television and radio. I mean, that's something which I certainly haven't heard about. And again, it's changing our societies. We heard about also the importance of how institutions can move forward, how they have the restrictions need to be intelligent and adaptable. And the double-edged sword of Zoom, that it's in one way bringing people together more than ever, but also there's that critical gap, you know, for laboratory work or for the development of this ethical citizen, where that face-to-face the interaction is critical, and there's a hanging question over that. So again, a really important topic. And we heard about how institutions themselves have a changing role, and how they're deepening ties with their communities, and how this is not only changing their role, but also offering opportunities and revenue streams for institutions, and by extension, of course, students. And that was really interesting. But we were left with that really unanswered question about COVID and how it's reversing gains in education, how it's making it harder for families and people to learn if they have young children. And as rightly mentioned, that's a whole new debate. So I would say, please watch this space. We will look forward to addressing, or we'll certainly be addressing that question going forward. And again, thank you very much for the contributions. It's been really interesting.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you once again for our panelists, and of course for SciDev for hosting this forum. So for our audience, please watch out for future events of SciDev.net. I know that they are available on Facebook. That's SciDev.net, Asia and Pacific. So that's all for now. Thank you, everyone.